Good morning. My name's Dr. Denise Franowski, and this is this week's A Dose from Dr. Denise, where I hope to teach, show, and inspire you how to release your God-given health and life potential. This week, I want to talk about what we all do in a crisis, and I'm calling it the anatomy of a crisis. And I want to step through the three things that I think happen in most crises in our lives. The first thing I wanted you to do is truly think back over the past years of your life and think of one crisis that just still stays with you. It could have been a marital crisis. It could be a crisis with a child being sick or addicted to drugs. It could be a financial crisis, a business crisis. Certainly all the things that are happening in our news in recent weeks and months are categorized as significant crises personally and certainly as a nation and a world. And essentially, I think there's three parts of a crisis. And that's what I want to step through, and I want to share a personal crisis that we went through as a family. And I want to talk to you about how I think that God helps us through and with and in and after our crises. The first, of course, part of a crisis is the crisis. It's interesting that the first three letters of crisis are CRI, or I would call that cry. We are crying out because we are in a world of hurt. In a crisis, of course, everything around us shuts down other than our tunnel vision of what immediately is happening. And it chops us right down to our knees. In fact, crises are usually when we will fall to our knees and pray out to God. In particular, if we're not praying people, we become praying people really, really quick. And so part one of the crisis is just being in it. Sometimes in that first part of the crisis, or when we're in the tunnel, if you will, in that crisis, you may feel a peace. And the Bible describes this as a peace that passes all understanding. And then there's other times that we're in a crisis where we don't feel that peace, and it feels quite silent. And I heard it said this week when I was listening to some Rick Warren teachings. He said that a lot of times when we're taking a test, the teacher doesn't speak to us. And I've never heard that before. The teacher is silent during the test. So sometimes you're going to feel a peace immediately, and sometimes you won't. It will feel quite silent. Once we get through the crises, which could take days, weeks, months, years, there's what I would call the post-crisis. That's when we are really nervy. We're on edge. Our nervous system is rebooting. Fear rears its ugly head more often than we would like it. And we're just trying to get through and heal from the crisis. And then the third part of a crisis is what I would call optional. And that is taking the crisis to a point where we can create something better in our life, or we take that tragedy and we transform it into something amazing. I think of the first mother that lost a child from a drunk driving accident and created MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Certainly that woman turned a crisis into something that has been beneficial for the whole world, frankly. So my personal crisis, I've had several. And the one that really sticks out the most is when our 13-year-old, at the time, son Hunter had MRSA from football. It happened in September of 2013, and it was all quite rapid. He developed MRSA in his elbow. We didn't recognize what it was. It had rapidly spread to his armpit, where he developed an abscess. And before you know it, we were in the middle of an emergency critical situation, and we were in the emergency room, and for the next 2 weeks it was probably the worst crisis that my husband and I, and certainly our son and other son, went through in our extended family. So just to quickly step through the three parts that we went through, you know, in the middle of the crisis, day one was horrible when we were in the emergency room, and I absolutely thought my son was dying because the infectious disease doctor told us that the bacterial infection perhaps spread to his bones and certainly was in his blood. So that was really, really scary. And I freaked out, and I sent my husband home that night to get my Bible and my Kindle because I wasn't planning on leaving the hospital until I left with Hunter. And the next morning, as God would have it, it was early in the morning, it was about 4:30 a.m., and I opened up my Kindle. And as God is my witness, I opened up to a Norman Vincent Peale book called Positive Living Day by Day. It's a calendar, and each day Norman Vincent Peale shares a story or sermon or a word. And that day, it literally read, the reason that we are so frightened of disease is we think the outcome is inevitable, but with God and with Jesus Christ, all things can be overcome. And it said something to that degree, but at that point, I did receive a peace that passes all understanding. I can't explain it. And I turned from fear to love because I knew in my heart that love was going to solve that situation. So that was during the crisis. And Hunter did live and did very, very well. It was 2 weeks. And then the post-crisis for us probably lasted, I would say, upwards to a year, maybe beyond. Anytime Hunter got a little skin rash, anything at all that resembled what we went through, fear would rear its ugly head. And it was scary. And at one point, I finally realized that our faith had to override our fear, and we had to just pass through that post-trauma stage and trust God. I know in the Bible, a frequently quoted verse in Romans is that all things work together for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And I would just frequently refer back to that quote, that I knew that I was going to be able to get through this. And so that stage lasted about a year. And then the third stage for all of us is an optional stage. I would say that many of us stay stuck in either the first, the crisis stage for our whole life, or the post-crisis stage where fear is overriding our faith. But if you can get to stage 3, then that's a beautiful thing. And stage 3 is what I would call the learning stage. What did we learn from our crises? How can we apply it in our everyday life? For me, again, personally, I learned to have a greater respect for allopathic medicine. As a chiropractor, we tend to develop a battle with allopathic medicine, which is just wrong. And I know that there's a time and place for medicine. I say there's a time and place for medicine. It's just not every time and every place. And so I developed a deeper respect for allopathic medicine. I learned that love absolutely overrides fear, and I loved every single person in that hospital. And my love was extremely strong during that time, and so was my faith. I remember the peace that I felt during the hospital stay with Hunter, and it wasn't a typical peace that you would feel. And there were some other things that I learned personally. But I would ask that you evaluate the crises that you are in or that you have been in through those 3 stages, and ask yourself, what can you learn from them? A few things that I want to remind you of is that crises bring us to our knees. Most people will say that a crisis absolutely positively brings us to our knees. And I would ask you to prayerfully consider next time that happens that you just stay there. You know, sometimes you got to wonder if crises happen in our lives so that we begin praying. And I know in a Denzel Washington, I think it was a talk that he gave at a graduation ceremony at college once, which I love this. He said that he keeps his slippers under his bed so that in the morning when he has to get them out, pulling them out from underneath the bed, he just stays on his knees and prays. And I think of that often, is that if a crisis brings you to your knees, maybe proverbially, we should just stay there. If we could stay in a constant state of prayer or near constant, the Bible says that. Paul says that we should pray unceasingly. And it would really be cool if unconsciously you get to the point where you're praying all the time. It's a higher vibration. It's a vibration of love. So that's one thing that I would ask if you could consider just staying in a state of prayer. The other thing that I got out of our crises, and I think of these shootings, I think of the 17 students that were killed, and then I think of the hundreds and hundreds that weren't, and I think of that glorious reunion of the parents with the child when they came out of the school. Maybe that was the morning that they didn't kiss them goodbye or they didn't make their breakfast. But you can only imagine what the reunion would be like with the child that survived. Perhaps we would be in deeper appreciation of just the small things in life, having a conversation at breakfast, the sun that rises, the cardinal that was just singing in my window. It sounds so trivial to say these things, but we do forget to stop and smell the roses. And I think a crisis allows that to come out. The last is, I would just ask, if a crisis brings you more God-centered, could you stay there? We are so focused on the external world. And when we go through a crisis, it allows us to have this tunnel vision while we're in it. And in the various crises that I've been in my life, because I've developed so much of my life, in particular in the last 20 years, in faith, with a relationship with God, I get tunnel visioned with God. And I know that my Redeemer lives, and I know that He's there to support me through a crisis. And I would just challenge you to develop that type of relationship, because the crises are always going to come. Hopefully they're few and far between, but life on earth was never promised to be without trial or tribulation. In fact, it's what makes us stronger. It's the proverbial caterpillar turning into a butterfly. It's the child being born and going through the birth canal, which is quite painful for the mother, and I can only imagine that it's painful for the child. So sometimes our greatest crises and our greatest traumas bring out an amazing transformation in our life. So evaluate your crises, evaluate the crises that our great country is going through right now. Perhaps our country is being reborn into something amazing and wonderful. I'm an optimist. I see the glass half full, and I know that there's a reason that these things are happening, and I know that we have the intelligence and the power within us because God lives in us to solve all those things. So that's some things to think about, the anatomy of a crisis. God bless, have a great week, and I'll see you next Sunday.